5 days. That is all that is left. 5 days before a ceasefire expires, before a diplomatic window slams shut, and before two of the most powerful nations on Earth activate simultaneous blockades that could strangle the arteries of global trade from both ends at the same time. In the last 24 hours, something changed. Not in a way that made headlines everywhere, not in a way that most people are even aware of yet, but intelligence analysts, naval commanders, and energy market officials are watching one specific scenario right now with the kind of focused, quiet attention that only happens when something very serious is about to go very wrong. The scenario is this: the United States has been tightening a naval blockade around Iranian ports. Iran's military has now warned, publicly and directly, that if that blockade continues, they will respond by shutting down the Red Sea, the Gulf, and the Sea of Oman to international shipping. And the ceasefire that has been holding this entire situation in a fragile, temporary pause expires on April 21st. No deal has been confirmed. No second meeting has been scheduled. And the clock is running. Now, here is the thing that most people don't fully understand yet. This isn't two countries threatening each other over a piece of land or a political disagreement. This is two countries with their hands on the switches of the global economy. The United States controls access to Iranian ports. Iran controls access to some of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet. If both switches flip at the same time, we are not talking about a regional crisis. We are talking about a simultaneous double blockade, one at each end of the global supply chain, and the consequences of that scenario have not been calculated in peacetime since the Cold War. Let me slow down and explain exactly why that matters, because this is where it gets serious. Every single day, roughly 12% of all global trade passes through the Red Sea. That number might not sound dramatic until you translate it into real terms. Electronics from Asia heading to Europe, fuel shipments going north, agricultural goods, medical equipment, consumer products, all of it. The Red Sea is not a side route. It is not an alternative path. It is one of the primary arteries of the modern global economy. If you close the Red Sea, ships must reroute around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That adds 10 to 14 days to every voyage. And that delay is not just a scheduling inconvenience. It is a cost that multiplies across millions of individual transactions, thousands of supply chains, and dozens of national economies simultaneously. And here is the second part that makes this so dangerous. The Gulf of Oman is not a minor waterway either. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which feeds directly from the Gulf. Iran's warning specifically included the Gulf, which means when Iranian military officials used the words the Red Sea, the Gulf, and the Sea of Oman, they were not speaking loosely. They were describing a total maritime containment strategy designed to hit the global economy at multiple pressure points simultaneously. Military analysts are already warning that if this threat is executed, the impact on oil prices alone would be immediate, severe, and cascading. Now, let me back up and give you the full picture, because this situation didn't begin 24 hours ago. It has been building for weeks, and what's happening right now is the result of a series of decisions that each seemed individually manageable until suddenly they weren't. The U.S. naval presence near Iranian ports has been increasing steadily. The stated justification has been pressure, strategic, economic, and diplomatic pressure, designed to force Iran toward a deal on its nuclear program. This is the classic playbook. You isolate a country economically. You restrict its ability to export. You make the cost of holding out higher than the cost of negotiating. And in theory, you create the conditions for a deal. But Iran's response to this pressure has not been to fold. Iran's response has been to escalate the language of retaliation until the language became a credible military warning. And here is where the hidden problem lives. The United States strategy assumes that Iran will eventually yield under pressure. But Iran's calculation is different. Iran is looking at the U.S. blockade and calculating that if the blockade continues past the ceasefire expiration date with no deal, the cost of doing nothing is greater than the cost of acting. Because if the blockade tightens permanently and Iran accepts it passively, it signals weakness to every regional adversary. It loses leverage in every future negotiation, and it accepts a permanent condition of economic strangulation. So, from Iran's perspective, the only way to maintain leverage is to demonstrate credible retaliation. And the most powerful retaliation available to them is not a missile strike. It is not a military confrontation. It is closing the waterways that every other country in the world depends on. It is essentially saying, you cannot hurt us without hurting yourself and everyone else at the same time. And that's not a bluff, that's a strategic calculation. Now, intelligence reports suggest that within the Trump administration, there are officials who understand this and who have been pushing internally for a second in-person meeting before April 21st. CNN has confirmed that these discussions are happening at the highest levels of the administration. There are people in that building right now arguing that the diplomatic window has not fully closed and that a face-to-face meeting could still pull this situation back from the edge. But here is the problem. As of right now, no meeting has been scheduled. The internal discussions are real. The urgency is real. But the actual date on a calendar with both parties in the room does not exist. And April 21st is not a soft deadline. April 21st is a hard legal and diplomatic date. When it passes without a deal, the ceasefire formally expires. And at that moment, both sides are technically free to activate whatever they had been holding back. Think about what that means in practical terms. The U.S. blockade becomes permanent. Iran's military warning becomes executable. And suddenly, you have two parallel blockades running simultaneously, one on Iranian ports, one on three of the most critical maritime corridors in the world. And here is what nobody is saying loudly enough right now. The global economy has never faced a simultaneous double blockade of this scale. Not in recent history. Not in the modern era of just-in-time supply chains and interconnected global markets. The models that economists use to calculate the impact of supply disruptions are built on scenarios where one thing breaks at a time. They are not built for the scenario where the U.S. locks down one end and Iran locks down the other. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is the oil price shock that would follow within 72 hours of a Red Sea closure. Right now, oil is trading at levels that are uncomfortable but manageable for most economies. Under a double blockade scenario, energy analysts at Reuters are projecting that oil could breach $120 per barrel within days of an activation. Not weeks, days. Because the market doesn't wait for the physical disruption to be confirmed. The market prices in the risk the moment the risk becomes credible. And a simultaneous closure of the Red Sea, the Gulf, and the Sea of Oman, triggered by an expired ceasefire and an active U.S. naval blockade, would be one of the most credible risk signals the energy market has ever seen. At $120 per barrel, the economic math changes for almost every country on Earth. For Europe, which imports a massive proportion of its energy and is already dealing with elevated costs, it is a near recession trigger. For developing economies in Southeast Asia and Africa, it is potentially catastrophic because energy cost shocks in those economies don't stay in the energy sector. They spread into food prices, transportation costs, and basic manufacturing almost immediately. And here is the cascading part that makes this unlike almost any other crisis scenario. The Red Sea closure doesn't just affect oil. It affects everything that moves through it. Electronics, pharmaceuticals, agricultural shipments. The rerouting cost alone, 10 to 14 extra days per voyage, times thousands of ships, adds somewhere between $500 and $1,000 per container. Multiply that across the scale of global shipping, and you are looking at an inflationary shock that hits virtually every consumer product on Earth simultaneously. This is why defense experts are now realizing that the ceasefire deadline on April 21st is not just a diplomatic date, it is an economic tripwire. Now let's talk about options. because this is where the situation reveals how trapped everyone actually is. Option 1. The U.S. eases the naval blockade unilaterally to give diplomacy more space. This is the obvious de-escalation move. Back off the pressure, give Iran something to work with, and create the conditions for a second meeting. The problem is that unilateral easing signals weakness. It tells Iran that threats work. It tells every other country watching that the U.S. will back down under economic pressure. For an administration that has built its entire foreign policy identity around strength and leverage, this option is politically and strategically almost impossible to take. Option 2. Iran walks back its maritime threat publicly, announces that the Red Sea warning was rhetorical, not literal, agrees to extend the ceasefire and return to the table. The problem is that Iran has made this threat publicly and specifically through its military command. Walking it back now would cost them credibility in a region where credibility is the only real currency, and it would signal to the United States that the blockade is working, which would likely cause the U.S. to tighten it further rather than ease it. Option 3. A second meeting happens in the next 5 days. Both sides come to the table with enough flexibility to extend the ceasefire and restart meaningful talks. This is the scenario that exists inside certain diplomatic briefings as the realistic best case. The problem is that a meeting in 5 days, with enough substance to actually prevent activation, requires both sides to move faster than they have moved at any point in this entire process. And the internal U.S. deliberations that CNN has confirmed suggest that the administration is not yet aligned on what a second meeting would even offer. Option 4. The ceasefire expires. Iran activates a partial closure, not the full shutdown, but a demonstrated capability. A few ships turned back, an oil tanker delayed. A signal, not a declaration. This is the scenario where Iran tries to show credible force without triggering a full military response. The problem is that partial closures of major maritime corridors are almost impossible to keep partial. The insurance market reacts. Shipping companies reroute immediately. Oil prices spike on the news alone. And the U.S. military has its own decision-making process that a partial Iranian action would immediately activate. A signal can very quickly become a confrontation. Option 5. Nothing happens. The ceasefire expires. Both sides make statements, but neither activates. The threats remain threats, and the situation stabilizes in a new, tenser form of the existing status quo. This is the scenario that optimists rely on, and it is possible, but it requires both sides to simultaneously choose restraint at a moment when the political incentives on both sides are pushing toward demonstration of strength. None of these options is clean. None of them resolves the underlying conflict. And in every version of this scenario, except the last one, the global economy absorbs some degree of shock. Now, this is where the situation takes a serious turn, because even in the best case scenario, even if the ceasefire is extended and talks resume, the structural problem doesn't go away. The U.S. naval presence near Iranian ports doesn't disappear overnight. Iran's military capability in the maritime domain doesn't disappear. The fundamental tension between a country that wants to use blockade as leverage and a country that can respond with maritime counter-leverage, that tension is now permanent until there is an actual deal. And here is the deeper thing that most analysis misses. The Red Sea is not just an Iranian leverage point. It is a global vulnerability that Iran has now publicly identified and claimed the right to exploit. Every shipping company, every insurance underwriter, every logistics operator in the world has now heard Iran say, this waterway is on the table. That changes how they price risk. It changes how they route ships. It changes how they plan supply chains. Even if April 21st passes without activation, the cost of this threat, the pure cost of it existing as a credible scenario, has already entered the global economic calculation. Intelligence reports suggest that Lloyd's of London and other major marine insurers began revising their Red Sea risk models within hours of Iran's warning. That is not a coincidence. That is the market telling you exactly how seriously it is taking this. And the oil market is watching the same clock. There is a specific mechanism here that creates a feedback loop nobody is talking about. Oil prices are already sensitive to Red Sea disruptions. We saw this during the Houthi attacks over the past year, but the Houthi scenario, as serious as it was a non-state actor with limited capability. What Iran is describing is state-level maritime interdiction. The capability gap between those two scenarios is enormous. Iran has submarines, it has mines, it has anti-ship missiles, it has the ability not just to threaten the Red Sea, but to close it in a way that would require a major naval operation to reopen. Military analysts are now pointing out that the U.S. Navy's ability to reopen the Red Sea against active Iranian interdiction is not the question. The U.S. Navy can do that. The question is what happens to oil prices, supply chains, and global inflation during the weeks or months it would take to do it. Because the damage is not just in the act of closing, the damage is in the uncertainty. The damage is in every ship captain who decides not to enter the Red Sea until the situation is resolved. The damage is in every contract that gets repriced, every delivery that gets delayed, every supply chain that gets restructured around a worst-case assumption. The reality is that by the time any military response has reopened the waterways, the economic shock will already have propagated through the system. You cannot unspike an oil price. You cannot undelay a shipment. You cannot unraise a consumer price. The damage happens in real time, and the recovery takes months to years. And here is the piece that ties all of this together. This is happening 5 days before a hard deadline, not 5 months, not 5 weeks, 5 days. The conversations that need to happen at the highest levels of two governments in the next 120 hours in order to prevent the activation of this scenario, those conversations have not been scheduled. They are being discussed internally. They are being pushed by certain officials who understand the stakes, but they have not resulted in a date, a location, or a confirmed agenda. In diplomacy, the difference between being discussed and being scheduled is the difference between a possibility and a plan. Right now, there is a possibility. There is no plan. And here is the final piece of this that I want you to sit with. The global economy has spent the last several years absorbing shock after shock, COVID supply chain disruptions, the war in Ukraine and its impact on energy and food prices, the Houthi Red Sea campaign, inflationary pressures from multiple simultaneous sources. Central banks around the world have used most of their conventional tools to manage these shocks. Interest rates are still elevated. Debt levels are high. The cushion that existed in 2019, the economic resilience that allowed governments to absorb and respond to crises, that cushion is thinner now. A simultaneous double blockade in this specific economic environment, in this specific moment of depleted fiscal and monetary flexibility, is not just a crisis. It is a crisis landing on a foundation that is already stressed. That is the scenario that is sitting 5 days away with no confirmed deal, no scheduled meeting, and two countries with their hands on two different switches. Defense experts are now realizing that the April 21st deadline is not just a geopolitical date. It is a pressure test for the entire architecture of the global economy. And the architecture is not in the best shape it has ever been. So, where does this leave us? The most honest answer is in a genuinely uncertain place. There are serious, experienced people inside the U.S. government who want a deal. There are probably serious, experienced people inside the Iranian system who understand what a full maritime closure would actually mean, not just for the U.S., not just for the West, but for every trading nation in the world, including the nations that Iran needs as economic partners. The logic of de-escalation exists on both sides, But logic does not always drive decision-making at moments of maximum political pressure. And both sides are under maximum political pressure right now. The U.S. administration cannot be seen yielding to an Iranian military threat. The Iranian government cannot be seen accepting a permanent blockade without response. These are not irrational positions. They are the positions of two governments that are also performing for their domestic audiences, their regional allies, and their strategic adversaries simultaneously. And that is what makes a countdown like this so dangerous. It is not that both sides want war. It is that both sides want to not back down. And in the space between two parties that each need to not back down, the clock keeps running. 5 days. No confirmed deal, no scheduled meeting, two blockades ready to activate from opposite ends of the global supply chain. And somewhere in the next 120 hours, someone has to make a phone call. Someone has to agree to a meeting. Someone has to offer something that the other side can take back to their people as a win. Because if they don't, if the 21st arrives with nothing in place, the world wakes up on the 22nd in a fundamentally different economic reality. Oil at levels that haven't been seen in years, shipping routes in chaos, insurance markets in retreat, supply chains repricing around a new risk that is no longer theoretical. And the question that nobody can answer yet is this: is there someone in that room on either side who has enough authority, enough credibility, and enough flexibility to make this call before the clock runs out? Or are we watching two of the world's most powerful actors walk toward April 21st because neither one has found a way to stop without feeling like they lost? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all: if this is the scenario that was always available to Iran, if closing the Red Sea was always on the table, why are we only now having this conversation 5 days before a deadline? What does it mean that this threat was always there, always calculable, always one decision away? And what does it tell us about how fragile the architecture of global trade actually is when a single country, by activating one military order, can hold the movement of goods for the entire planet? Sit with that, because the answer changes everything about how you think about the next 5 days and about what comes after, regardless of what happens on April 21st.